Hey guys, what is up? Super K Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCK semifinals and finals overview and analysis video here in the summer split. We are finally here at the end of our playoff journey in the LCK. They are one of the final regions to really wrap up their playoff structure here, and of course they still have the regional finals coming up as well, and so the LCK is certainly not done after this video, but by the end of this video, not only are we going to know the team that's going to be joining Gen.G in the finals, we're going to be knowing the team that's joining Gen.G as a automatic qualification for Worlds, and that's really, really exciting. The three teams that are left in the LCK are all very, very good for very different reasons, and, you know, we'll go ahead and go over kind of what I'm feeling about a lot of these teams. Of course, if you followed the playoff coverage up until this point, you probably have a good idea as to where I'm sitting with a lot of these teams, but, you know, so far, things have pretty much gone according to plan from my predictions. I got a lot of pushback on my bracket prediction, and pretty much everything has gone pretty much exactly as I expected. We'll see if that continues in this one, but of course, let me know down in the comment section below what you thought of these two series. Did you get the expected outcome? Did things go as you anticipated, or was there a little bit of an upset? Was there, you know, maybe some things that didn't go your expected way? Would love to know you guys' thoughts on just everything down below. Was it fun to watch? You know, would love to hear you guys' thoughts on everything, but without further ado, we've got two series to cover in today's video, and they're very important, so let's go ahead and kick it off. Of course, if you're new here, what we're going to do is go game by game in each series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and then at the end of each series, I'm going to be giving a player of the series as well, and so really excited to get into it. Of course, we have to start off with our semifinals or our lower bracket finals, however you want to kind of classify that. And that's a really interesting matchup, a rematch of a round 2 matchup and a telecom war between T1 and KT Rolster. Really, really happy to see these two teams get another shot to play against each other. Not only is it always fun to see these two teams play against each other because of the rivalry that they share, but both of them are very volatile this year. KT Rolster was the #1 team in the regular season, and they did kind of dominate a lot of the other teams to get here into the playoffs, but things have not necessarily gone their way. They weren't able to overcome T1 in the upper bracket in round number 2. Maybe they made the mistake of picking them as their opponent in that position, but either way, they're going to get a shot and a chance to rectify that decision here in this series. T1 obviously really struggling down the stretch in the regular season without Faker, but Faker has returned, and it feels like everybody's basically gotten back into best in the world form, which is about as good as you could possibly ask for. Now, there are some question marks about T1. There are question marks about KT as well. We'll kind of get into that. I think matchup-wise, it's very interesting to see these two teams go against each other. Zeus versus Keem is going to be an incredibly important matchup. Zeus has arguably been the single best player in the LCK in the playoffs. I certainly think that there is an argument to be made for that. He has been phenomenal for T1, but Keem really is the driving force for a lot of what KT does. I think if one of those two is able to generate consistent leads in the top lane, that's going to be a pretty big deal. Now, Owner has also struggled quite a bit for T1. He's really been the player that I think has rebounded the least since Faker has come back, but, you know, if he can get back into form and if he can be better than Cuz, T1 should be able to handle this series relatively easily. Guma and Keria should be the better bot lane in this series, although I don't really think it's by a ton, and Faker versus BDD is always a fun matchup, and so you've got a lot of different moving parts moving in here, but like I said in my, you know, pre-playoff prediction video, my primer video, I could see either of these teams winning a series like this. It went to 5 in round number 2. I would be shocked if it wasn't close again. These two teams are just both very good, and I don't expect either to be able to generate a massive lead. I had them split 1-1 in the playoffs when I covered it in my primer. That's definitely possible here, but I think T1 is going to have a little bit of the mental advantage because of their win earlier. Also, Faker getting to finals, it's an LCK story that you simply have to expect at this point, and so is that going to be the case? Are we going to get another Gen.G T1 finals, or is KT going to disrupt the process and make finals themselves to keep their automatic qualification hopes alive? Well, we're going to find out at the very least in the start here with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was T1. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0. Obviously, really nice win for them here. You want to be able to generate that momentum. You want to get that confidence on your side early on in a series like this. Both of these teams can be relatively volatile. T1, obviously, we saw throughout the regular season, not necessarily the most consistent team, but KT Rolster, I think, underratedly, you know, has, picked up their momentum and picked up their consistency over the back half of the year. Obviously, the regular season definitely proved that, but I do think that they are a team that balances a lot on confidence and balances a lot on momentum, and so you want to make sure that you can get that on your side early, and unfortunately for KT, they just played rather poor in this game number 1. They certainly came in with a game plan, but it's the same game plan that so many teams have tried to play against T1, and it's just never worked. This is something that we call, the mind control strategy. There really is no other way to describe it, because it seems like every time teams want to go into T1, they want to attack Faker. They want to put everything they have into trying to shut Faker down, but Faker is so good at avoiding giving up negative plays and also not really needing to be a carrier, not really needing to have a ton of resources in order to be relevant in the late game, and that's exactly kind of the example for what happened in this game. Player of the game for me is going to go to Faker in the mid lane. He wasn't necessarily the carry of this game. He wasn't dealing the most damage. He wasn't dominating every single team fight. However, without Faker playing the way that he did in this game, I just simply don't think T1 win nearly as easily. He got mega camped in the early game here. Cuz was in that lane over and over and over again, trying to get the Azir behind, trying to get the Xerath for BDD ahead, and Faker just outplayed it every single time, was never giving over anything to the side of KT Rolster, and basically wasted the entire early game for KT, all the while they were getting a lot on the map. Owner had some really good pathing in this game on the Maokai. Zeus played phenomenal, was definitely the better top laner in this game. We'll talk about him in a second, but again, without Faker, I think this game was so much more difficult for T1 to be able to win, and so you've got to be incredibly impressed with how he played, and again, this is just what he does. This is the strategy that T1 ends up having to go to in so many games, because so many teams feel like it's their only shot to be able to win, is to take out Faker. I completely disagree, and I think this was another example of that, but I very narrowly gave this to Zeus in the top lane, who I do think had another fantastic game here on the Aatrox. Really good stuff. Aatrox is a champion that we've seen rise in popularity a lot throughout the playoffs in a lot of different regions, namely here and in North America. But Zeus, I think, piloted it really well. I said earlier that I think the matchup between him and Keen is going to determine a lot in this series. Zeus has been spectacular in this playoff run, and that certainly continued in this game. Owner had some really good pathing. Kuma and Keria were solid, especially after the pick ban phase. Look at the bans from the side of T1. Alistair, Nautilus, Blitzcrank, Leona, Amumu. 5 supports. And even on the other side, KT banned out Rakan, they banned out Rel, they banned out Thresh, and Keria had the Lulu pick taken away, and so there was a lot of priority, I should say, put on a lot of the top tier engagers in the bot lane, and I think that definitely benefited T1, gave them a little bit more proactivity, and I still think enchanters are relatively good. I think T1's starting to identify that. It'll be interesting to see if other teams start moving in that direction. I think enchanters are solid. I just think that engagers obviously are more fun and give you a little bit more proactivity as a support, and so most supports are going to go towards engagers if they're relatively even in power level, but Keria showing. Lulu still very good. The Zeri was fine. I sometimes worry about Zeri Azir combos because it can be a little bit too passive in the early game, but T1 played the early game really well. They were the better team, and they came out on top. And then for KT on the other side, pretty bad game. I'm not going to lie. Like, this was just kind of them misplaying in a lot of different directions. Nobody really played all that well. Dud of the game was super obvious to me. It's got to go to BDD. This was a Xerath game that he's going to want to forget. Xerath, another champion that we're seeing rising in popularity, specifically again here and in North America. And I just don't think BDD piloted it very well. It wasn't a very good pick for KT. He was consistently out of position, way too far forward. On Xerath, you really need to make sure that you are watching where you are standing, because you're going to die almost instantly if you are in a position to take damage, and unfortunately BDD wasn't playing with that level of confidence. KT put a lot of responsibility and a lot of pressure into BDD this game, and it just was not paid back really at all. I like BDD. I think he's a really good player. I think he's been probably the best player on this team in their playoff run up until this point, but this was a pretty miserable game number 1. I think you could say the same thing about Cuz in the jungle, who just had a strategy and it didn't work, right? Like, he got out jungled in the early game. He decided that he wanted to focus mid, try to get the Azir offline, try to get the Xerath online, but it failed so much that it ended up costing them the game, I think. You can talk about Keen not having nearly enough pressure on the top side as Cassante into Aatrox. You can talk about Lehens pulling out the Singed and having it do basically nothing the entire game. There are a lot of, fingers you could point in this game for KT Rolster, but I think the easiest way to say it is you just kind of got outplayed in the first game of the series, and that's okay. You're allowed to get outplayed every once in a while, but you have to be able to bounce back. You have to make this series more interesting. Game 1 really was not all that close. Game 2 has to be close. You certainly don't want to go down 0-2 to T1. Winning 3 games in a row against this T1 team is certainly not going to be an easy feat. So KT doesn't want to put themselves in that position, but T1 could take full control of this series if they play a similar game to what they did here in the first one. So are they going to be able to do that, or is KT going to bounce back and tie the series up at 1 apiece? Well, the winner of game number 2 was T1, they are going to take game number 2 here. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and this is disaster zone for KT Rolster. I mean, you could not possibly ask for a worse start to this series than what KT had, because honestly, they were just outplayed in both games. It feels like whatever strategy, whatever game plan that they had going into this series, it's not working, and it's pretty clear what their game plan was. I just don't understand why they indexed so hard into that game plan, because I just don't think it's one that was ever going to be all that conducive towards success. There was a ton of pressure again in this game towards Faker in the mid lane, not only in the early game, but in the late game as well. A ton of flashes in attempts to try to kill him, and, you know, they were only able to get it the one time, but they ended up trading basically everything else on the map for it. It, again, feels like this mind control mojo that T1 just has, that Faker in particular as a player just has. I don't know what happens when teams go into Faker, but their brains just shut off. They give up everything to kill him, and I mean everything. I mean Nexus. Like, it is absurd what happens. You know, Lehen's flashing level 1 to try and get onto the Azir and ends up having to just walk it off because he doesn't get anything done. Aiming later in the game, flashing right into the middle of the fight as Zeri to try and blow up the Azir only to die. Like, I don't get it. I do not understand what is going through the minds of these players when they see Faker in a position where it's like, we have to kill him now. We have to kill him and we win the game. That's not how it works, man. Like, even if Faker dies, you probably still don't win any of those fights, and so pretty wild stuff. But again, player of the game simply has to go to Faker in the mid lane. There really is no other option. I know he's not doing the most damage. I know he's not carrying any of these team fights, but his presence alone and his ability to stay alive and to dodge a lot of the pressure coming in from KT Rolster is single-handedly winning T1 these games. Obviously, there are a lot of positives that you can talk about on the side of T1. They continue to want to go towards these enchanters in the bot lane, and I do think that Keria is playing Lulu at a very high level across these first 2 games, continuing to show that that champion is in a relatively okay spot, and certainly can still be played if you want to play more for these team fight comps. But Owner was spectacular in this game on the Sejuani. His pathing in the early game was great. Cuz was really bad in this game again, which we will get to, but Owner was very active and was definitely more important towards the back half of this game as well, which is massive if you are the Sejuani playing into a Viego, being able to generate more pressure in the late game, you know, kind of shutting down that Viego was always going to be a major positive in your camp. Zeus continues to be awesome on this Aatrox. It continues to be a really big pick for T1, and Zeus in general just continues to have a fantastic playoffs. He's really been phenomenal. I think the narrative that he is a choke artist is slowly starting to get out of my brain. I was never really someone that was entirely into that narrative, but he has been so much better than he was in the regular season in the playoffs that it's certainly something to consider. But everybody on T1 is playing well at the current moment. There really is no negatives that I can give this team as a whole. I do think that they're playing well as a unit, but again, it's the Faker mind control mojo that ends up taking over the game and being able to give T1 most of their advantages in this one. But for KT, like, why do you continuously fall into this trap? It really does feel like you are just getting completely out-mentaled in this series, and maybe it's because you did lose to T1 the first time around. Maybe you feel like you have to try and make a lot of these major plays, but you, of all teams, should know better than anyone not to continuously fall for this trap over and over and over again, but it continues to be an issue for them. Done of the game was actually kind of difficult because so many people, I think, played poorly from KT in this game. I'm going to give it to Lehen's in the support position because he was just simply too aggressive in this game. You've got a Zeri, you've got setup with the Annie, you've got the Renekton potentially on flanks. You don't need to be the one that creates absolutely everything on the Rakan, but I think he felt that pressure was kind of on him this game. I know that level 1 happened, but even outside of, like, everything else, I just don't think Lehen's played particularly well in this game. Aiming, I think, had a pretty bad game on the Zeri. I don't think that the scoreline will necessarily tell you that, but aiming was not very good in this one. I think the bot lane was definitely the biggest problem in my eyes. Keen continues to not be as good as Zeus, especially in the early laning phase. We saw the Aatrox generate a pretty consistent early lead and never really look back. Cuz had a really bad game on the Viego, never really got to the point where he could start taking over any of the team fights, and while BDD wasn't necessarily the biggest problem in this game, he certainly wasn't creating a lot of plays on the Annie either, was mostly trying to play from the back foot for most of this. KT just honestly feels completely outclassed right now, and I think that's about as disastrous of a thing as you could possibly say for them going into the rest of this series. T1 looks fantastic. They look like the better team. They look like they have the better mental. They look like they have the better macro. They look like they're better in lane. I really don't see a lot of avenues for KT to get back if they play like this. Now, we know KT isn't, you know, a team that plays like this all the time. If they can get some of their mental and mojo back what they had in the regular season, what they had in the previous series against Hanwha Life, like that KT can beat T1. They absolutely can beat T1, but they're going to have to do it now because they are on series point here going into game number 3. They're down 0-2. They're going to have to win all 3 of the final 3 games of this series to move on to the finals and to automatically qualify for Worlds, but T1's just got to win 1. So are they going to be able to close it out in this game number 3, or is KT going to be able to keep it alive at the very least for one more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was KT Rolster. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to, at the very least, keep this series alive for one more game. And obviously, this was a necessary win, but this was a good win for this KT team. This was a dominant win, one where they were definitely the better team. They had a much better draft. I think they had much more options in this game than what T1 had. Obviously, we'll talk about it in a little bit. I do like some of the picks that people are shitting on a bit for T1. I just think that KT honestly played a lot better here in game number 3 than they did even remotely at any point in games 1 and 2, because it never really was like super mechanical, although there were some pretty big mechanical mishaps in game number 2 for KT Rolster. It was a lot of just bad decision making, but I think they really relied a lot on their mechanical outplays in this game 3, and that's an avenue that they can play towards that I think can win them this series. They're an incredibly talented team with a lot of really good players, and I do think that they played well here in this game number 3. T1 obviously struggling to adapt, but a very aggressive comp on the side of T1 that ended up getting behind early. KT ended up just snowballing the game out of control. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game here in game number 3 is going to go to Aiming in the bot lane on this Zeri. We've seen him kind of go to the Zeri throughout this series up until this point. Kind of interesting to see if that's going to be a continuous thread. I do think that Zeri still is a spot where she can be played relatively easily. Like, I think that obviously she's not broken. She's not going to automatically win you the game in the late game, but Zeri still offers a ton of tools, and I still like her a lot as an AD carry potentially moving forward because of the utility and just the general stability that she offers you if you're good at her. And I think Aiming obviously really kind of moves in that direction as well, wanting to play this more late game hyper carry style that we've kind of seen him go towards for KT all year, and with a lot of the other ones being taken off the board. The Kai'Sa off the board, obviously Xayah ends up getting banned out in this game as well. The Aphelios being taken by Gumayushi. I do think that the Zeri is probably the next best AD carry on that list, and so very, very good to see him play it, and not only play it, but play it well. This was a really good game from Aiming, and definitely necessary, because I do think the bot lane had been a little bit disappointing up until this point in the series. I think game 2 in particular was definitely not ideal coming out from those players, but I think Aiming was really solid in this one. And then for Lehens, I think he was solid as well. This was a much better recon game than what he was in game number 2, where he was consistently just trying to create something out of nothing. That can be a positive, but when he was playing from so far behind, oftentimes it ended up just being more of a negative and giving more resources over to the side of T1 than was necessary. But this time he got to play from a lead. He got to play from an advantageous state, and I thought he was good. BDD is the other player that I think you're really going to shout out for having a good game. You can worry a bit about the matchup here. Tristana into Cassio can actually be relatively poor for the Tristana, because Cassio can actually just lock her down really, really simply. And, you know, especially if you're hitting ultimates, Faker has a lot of agency in order to be able to win in the late game, but never really was allowed to get there. The Tristana was so active in the early game, and BDD was doing so much damage, taking advantage of the fact that Cassio doesn't necessarily do anything for the first 10 minutes of the game. Tristana was moving around the map, creating a lot of pressure, and most notably was making Faker and Owner's life a lot more difficult, which is always going to be a positive for the mid lane. Cuz was good, definitely the better jungler. We'll get to that. Keen was solid enough. Wasn't necessarily a game-breaking top lane performance, but Aiming was really good. I think BDD was really good, and Cuz and Lehens were really good facilitators. I think this was just a much more clean game from KT Rolster, being able to get that lead early and then just kind of ending it. And then for T1 on the other side, you know, T1 picking Kha'Zix for Owner and losing, name a better duo. It's just kind of been how this team has gone throughout the year. Like I said earlier, this is a very aggressive comp. You're really relying a lot on being able to just kind of outplay your opponents in the early game, because quite frankly, you don't have a lot of tools. You need this Kha'Zix to be able to start getting online early, because you're going into Rel Tristana, and they're going to have that pressure. So Kha'Zix does need to have a really good early game. The problem is I don't think Owner is really all that good at Kha'Zix, or at least he hasn't been in the pro scene over the course of his career up until this point. And I think that that was a problem. As soon as the Kha'Zix started to lose a ton of pressure, all of a sudden the Cassio wasn't nearly as relevant. You couldn't shut down the Tristana nearly as easily. Gumayushi was trying to play well and was trying to get online, but you can only do so much on the Aphelios when they have so much immediate lockdown and damage coming in from the side of KT Rolster. He had to play super safe. Same thing with Keria. I don't think he necessarily played bad, and like I said, Zeus versus Keen was just kind of neutral up on the top side, but Owner versus Faker, or Owner versus Faker. Owner and Faker, I do think, were probably the two members of the team that stood out as not having good games. Owner is going to get the dud of the game because I do think you're relying a ton on the Kazakhs in this comp in particular to be able to do a lot of the early game heavy lifting, but the problem is that Owner got behind, and once that happened, like I said, it was just kind of doomed. It was not really winnable, in my opinion, for T1. But again, it's just game 3. You don't want to, overthink this too much. It is certainly an interesting draft and one that I probably wouldn't go to again, but you do want to close this out in 4. You certainly don't want to be going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5 having just lost 2 games in a row. That's all the confidence that KT would need in order to kind of go into that with as much momentum as they could possibly want. But for KT, you were able to stay alive. You got to be able to do it again here in game number 4. Game number 3 doesn't matter if you're not able to continue to win out. So, series is going to stay alive, but game 4 is now really, really important. Who's going to be able to take it? Will T1 show that, game 3 was a little bit of an outlier, of a fluke, or will KT show that they are coming back in this series, that games 1 and 2 aren't going to deter them, and they're going to be pushing us to a Silver Scrapes game 5? Well, we're going to find out right now, because the winner of game number 4 was KT Rolster. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to even up this series at 2 apiece, and reverse sweep incoming? It's certainly on the horizon. Of course, we're going to be going to a game number 5, and we'll talk about that in just a bit, but we've got to cover game number 4 first and foremost, because this was probably one of the more interesting games of the series up until this point. I think almost all of the games have definitely been in favor of one team over the other. Neither have really been these big back and forth affairs, but I do think that there were moments for T1 in this game where they were looking aggressive, where they were looking to try to make plays. I just don't think that a lot of those plays ended up working out for the team. And so KT ends up executing on a lot of their comp a little bit better, and because of that, they're going to be the ones to push us to a game number 5, which is massive for KT. The confidence, the momentum, I've talked about it so much over the course of this series already, but it is all going in their direction right now, and that's about the best thing that you can say for a team that really thrives on those things. So let's go ahead and talk about this game number 4. First of all, very interesting draft from both of these teams. We've seen people online really criticize kind of the Poppy plus Nico combo in general in jungle mid, because Nico wants to set people up in order to kind of group and really put themselves in a decent position to win these 5v5s, and Poppy likes to separate. However, I like this duo a lot more, I think, than a lot of other people on the internet do. I love the idea of adding something that basically forces the enemy team to fight you after you knock one of their members out with Poppy. I think that that's actually a really intriguing idea from a draft perspective, because there are 2 ways to kind of go about this. The way that I think a lot of people on the internet are looking at it is you Nico ult 5 people and then you just Poppy ult one of them out, and so you're ending up getting less value because you're really not capitalizing on something like that. But I do think if you flip that, if you just flip the order of that, if you Poppy ult, somebody out, all of a sudden it's a 4v5, and then you've got Nico on the flank to hit those 4 people, that's a guaranteed fight win. They can't now, what we see a lot with Poppy ults is the enemy team will then kite back to try to get this into a 5v5 as quickly as possible, but, then you set yourself up for a position where you're basically forcing a 4v5 from the other team, and that's almost always going to be a win. And so I do like the idea of this comp. I think the Gragas does make it a little bit more difficult and interesting to play into, but KT answers it with a Ryze top lane on the other side, which is certainly not something that I expected to see in the playoffs here. Obviously, we've seen this out of Keen and out of a lot of LCK top laners in the past before Ryze in general. Just a very big pick in Korea, and so I'm not entirely surprised to see it. It's certainly playable at the current moment, and into Gragas, it's always been a relatively good matchup, and on R5, it's certainly intriguing, but Keen really made it look incredibly overpowered in this game. He's going to get my player of the game there in the top lane. The amount of shred that he was doing on the front line of T1 towards the back half of this game completely destroyed any ability that they had of being able to win any of these team fights, and that's incredibly impressive from Keen. I know we're not really seeing a lot of Ryze, but split push pressure is still a really high, threat from this champion. We're not really seeing a lot of split push. We're seeing a lot of 5v5 comps, and I think Ryze kind of pulling that apart and being really good in both of those avenues, I think, is a big positive. And then obviously, he was impactful in the 5v5s. He was dealing a lot of damage, especially when things were set up well by Cuz and Lehens. And so, really good stuff from Keen. This was easily his best game of the series up until this point. I would argue that Zeus had absolutely been the better top laner through the first 3 games, but Keen, was definitely more impactful here in game 4, which I think is a good sign. Aiming continues to be really solid. I think BDD had a really good game on the Ahri. These 2 are incredibly important. I think Cuz obviously add on to that, the Rel in general. I think as a pick, you really need to make sure that you're doing a good job being able to express press that early pressure with the Rel, or else she's just not going to have nearly as much tempo as a lot of the other picks in the game. But I really like what KT was able to do with their comp in this game. I think they drafted something that I think for a lot of other teams might have not gone nearly as well, might have not gone nearly as consistently, but I think KT was good enough to be able to pull it off, and they played towards their strengths at a level that I don't think a lot of other teams in the world would be able to do. So really good game number 4 from KT. And then for T1 on the other side, you were so close. Like you made some plays this game where I think you were interesting. You certainly kept this from being an absolute blowout, which I think is a good thing for them, obviously, overall. However, I don't think that it was the cleanest game of all time, and that's why they ended up losing. Faker was really aggro on the Nico. Some of those times he was hitting 4 or 5-man ultimates, and it was like, this is really good, and he's setting up the rest of his team. Other times, he was just kind of going under tower, being way too aggro, and ends up dying for no reason, and that's going to be a little bit of a problem in and of itself. Now, I was going to give Dud of the game to him, but I am going to give it to Zeus in the top lane on this Gragas. He really felt disconnected from the rest of his team in a lot of these fights. Ended up not utilizing the ultimates nearly as well as I think he needed to in this game, and that ended up being a problem. Obviously, Owner on the Poppy, I don't think was particularly great. Guma and Keria were just kind of meh in the bot lane. I like Zeri plus Lulu. I think this is a combo that I would expect teams to go more towards as we go further along into the year, especially if a lot of other AD carries are going to be banned out. Kind of weird to see it with Kai'Sa up, but certainly intriguing. But I think the top side of the map kind of let them down again. Faker kind of had a rough game, especially towards the back half, and Zeus had his worst game of the series, one of his worst games of the playoffs, which if this is your worst game of the playoffs, that's probably a good thing because it really wasn't like a disaster from him. It just felt like he wasn't necessarily on the same page as everybody else. But for T1, you've got to win this now. Like you have put yourself in a position that you do not want to be in, with the potential to be getting reverse swept. And that's really not what you want to say if you are T1 in this instance. You want to be able to close this out. You want to be able to move on to finals. Remember, they don't automatically qualify if KT wins the split. If KT ends up moving on into the finals, we'll cover that series in a bit, but, they're not confirmed for Worlds or anything like that by this series alone, and so winning this would get them that spot at Worlds, which they would be happy about. But KT obviously wants to keep their hopes and dreams of not only being able to qualify for Worlds, but being able to win the LCK alive in this game number 5. Are they going to be able to complete the reverse sweep, or is T1 going to shut down their hopes? Well, we're going to find out now, because the winner of game number 5 was T1. They are going to take game number 5. They're going to win their second telecom war of the playoffs here. And they're going to be moving on to the finals in easily the biggest banger of the playoffs up until this point. This is a must-watch if you have not watched this game. I don't know how many people watch these videos and haven't seen these games up until this point, but if you haven't watched game number 5, go and watch game number 5. I know I've spoiled the outcome, but golly, I don't want you to get all the information from me. I will not be able to do this game justice for what it really was. You need to go and watch this because it was an absolute blast to see. 3 Barons were taken this game. All 3 of them were stolen. Elder was stolen. You got so many fights. You had T1 winning a fight 4-5. You had KT winning a fight 4-5. You just have so many moments, so many close, tense situations in these games that ended up making this game 5 really enjoyable to watch, but really good on T1 to be able to pick it up. Obviously, incredibly important towards their season. We'll talk about what it means in just a second. They have now officially qualified for Worlds, but they're going to be moving on to finals, and KT is going to be eliminated here in 3rd place. Certainly disappointing after what their regular season was, and I think a lot of what the expectations were, but this is what I predicted. I'm really not surprised. This is where I had them in my primer, and so, pretty much everything kind of going according to plan for me still up until this point. But let's talk about this game. It's going to be hard to give you, a breakdown of everything that happened because so much happened in this game, and so I'm just gonna kind of go over the implications of it all. I think everybody on T1 really did play well. I think people are gonna be looking at Owner on the Nocturne being able to steal away a lot of these important objectives, but for me, it was the carry roles that really stepped up for T1. It was Gumayushi, who's gonna get my player of the game here in game 5. The damage he was able to output on the Xayah was incredibly important, and he had a lot of support from that Lulu. Again, 5 games of Lulu from Keria in this series is certainly an intriguing development. I don't hate it. I really do think Lulu is pretty good in the meta right now, especially if you're going to ban out Alistar and Rel and Nautilus and a lot of these other super convenient and super efficient engagers. Lulu's still one of the best supports in the entire game, and I do think that picking her up here was a positive towards T1. But Guma, I think, played really well Just across most of the series, he's been incredibly consistent throughout the playoffs. Really has not been the main carry for the T1 team at any point. That's been a lot of saves, that's been Faker at times, but he's never been a problem. In their losses, he's typically their best player, etc., etc. He's just very consistent, and I think that's a positive. But player of the series for me overall, it's a no-brainer for me. It's got to go to Faker in the mid lane. He was the best player for T1 across these 5 games. I really do not believe that they win this series without Faker in the mid lane, not only because obviously he raises the floor of this team so much, as we saw with the regular season performances without him, but because I do think he played individually incredibly well. He was able to basically just outplay BDD and Cuz the entirety of this series. He was super influential in a lot of these team fights, and in all 3 of their wins, I think you could argue that he was the most important player towards their success, even if that doesn't necessarily translate to the damage charts. Just really good stuff from Faker. Zeus was solid again here in game number 5. Keen definitely struggled more on the Renekton than he did on the Ryze in game 4. Zeus was the better top laner in this series with the exception of that game 4. Owner was fine. I don't love Nocturne as a pick. I don't really like Nocturne Nico as a combo. I think it's very overrated, but if you're going to steal every objective, then yeah, you know what? Sure, give me that every day of the week, but for T1, just an absolute blast of a game. Really, really fun that we got to see it, and it sucks for KT Rolster to go out like this. It really did feel like they had a chance here in Game 5 to complete that reverse sweep, to kind of capitalize on the situation that they had set themselves up for, but unfortunately, just not able to get it done. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Cuz. Again, just gave over too many objectives. Now, he himself did get a couple of those, ended up getting 2 Barons, stealing 2 Barons, but at the end of the day, still just not enough. I think the team fighting from the Poppy was very lackluster. Certainly wasn't a big positive for me. But I think you could give that title to almost anybody on the side of KT Rolster. I think Keen had a rough game. I think Lehens was certainly not nearly as impactful. BDD on the Vygar certainly didn't do nearly enough. I do think Aiming tried his best, and he was the best player on KT Rolster this series, in my opinion, but it just wasn't enough. And now KT's going to have to move down into the regional qualifier, and that's always a little bit of a crapshoot. Now, they are going in as the top seed, which is a good thing. It means they get side selection in their matchup against Hanwha Life, who we already saw them absolutely decimate, but it's just unfortunate that, as the number 1 seed going in here at 17-1 in the regular season, they aren't going to be able to come out with an automatic qualification spot. It's certainly not what you were looking for if you were KT Rolster, but obviously, this is a team that I think a lot of people are going to consider favorites to be able to qualify for Worlds as the 3rd seed, let alone as the 4th seed. And so, as long as they can keep up some of the form that they showed, they were good in this series. They just were not good enough to be able to take down T1, but T1 was able to do it. They are going to be able to take the series. They're going to be moving on to the finals, and they are going to be qualifying for the World Championships. Gen.G and T1 are the 2 teams with the most championship points, and they're the 2 teams in the finals. So they're going to be your number 1 and number 2 seeds, respectively. Obviously, we'll talk in a bit about, which order they're going to be in that situation. The winner of the finals will end up being the 1 seed, the loser will be the 2 seed, but congratulations to T1 for all of their flaws and all of their ups and downs in the regular season. They were able to figure it out when it mattered the most. They're able to get back to another finals against Gen.G, and it's going to be really, really fun to talk about, but now that we've gotten the semifinals out of the way, we're going to be comboing it in this video. It's time to go over the LCK finals. But now we get to move on into the series you all kind of came here to see, probably, and that is going to be the LCK Summer Split Finals here in 2023, and always an exciting series in the finals here for the LCK. We've gotten some pretty uncompetitive finals in recent years, but that doesn't mean that the trend won't be bucked in this series. Obviously, very excited to see it, and we know the 2 teams. We'll go ahead and preview it very quickly. Of course, it's a matchup between the number 2 seeded Gen.G and the number 5 seeded T1. The 2 teams that end up making it here. Gen.G not losing a series in the playoffs, beating T1 to get to this spot in the first place. T1, of course, as we just saw, beating KT Rolster in a very close 5-game series to end up in this spot. But, I think I got a lot of hate in my primer video, and this is where I'm going to talk about it a little bit, because I was super into Gen.G. People called me biased. People said that, it was going to blow up in my face. I got a lot of comments on that. Gen.G right now looking pretty good going into the finals, not having lost a series. I had Pays as my regular season MVP and, of course, Rookie of the Year as well. I had them, as 3 of the 5 first-team All-Pro players, even though KT Rolster finished first in the regular season. I predicted them to win the LCK finals, and rightfully so. I think if you didn't believe in Gen.G nearly as much as I did, those kinds of statements would probably seem a little bit outlandish. But I really do believe in this team a ton, and so far they've proven me right. They are really consistent, and they play everything really well. They're the best macro team in the LCK by a considerable margin, and it's consistently shown. If you're the best macro team in your region, and you've also got Chovy and Peanut and Pays and Doran and Delight, like, that's a problem for a lot of other teams to to end up going into, because they're probably going to outskill and out-macro you. And so Gen.G very dangerous, but as we just saw for T1, they're certainly not going to be a team that goes down lightly. This is a team that really is clicking on all cylinders right now. Zeus is playing at the best level he's played at in 2023. Faker's looking really good. Guma and Keria have been crazy consistent for this team, and even Owner, at times he's been a little bit of a weakness, but, when he's playing these more supportive picks that can allow the rest of the team to flourish, he's looked a lot better. And so T1 certainly not going to be a team that you would expect to fall down relatively easily, but their finals curse absolutely still exists. And Gen.G is looking to take advantage of that. I would predict them to be able to do so. I think they're the best team in the LCK, and this was the prediction that I made at the beginning of the playoffs. This isn't a recency bias thing. This isn't new form. I really do believe Gen.G is just the better team, and I talked about that about a month ago. But let's go ahead and see if I end up getting proven right, or if T1 finally gets to break their finals curse. Well, we get to start it off, of course, with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Gen.G. They are going to take the first game in this series. They're going to go up 1-0. Really nice win from them here in game number 1. Basically exactly what you're looking for. You see T1 kind of go for this really risky comp, a very early game oriented comp that relies on a lot of 1v1 or 2v2 wins, right? You've got the Lucian Nami needing to be able to win early into that Zeri Rakan, or else they're just going to lose out on some pressure towards the back half of the game. Now, mid-game can obviously still be a possibility for them, and, we'll talk about that in a second, but the same thing with the Jace in the mid lane. You've got the Taliyah who wants to be moving around the map, but Jace is one of the few champions that I think really can isolate Taliyah and make her actually have to play the lane phase a little bit more aggressively. And so I don't hate the draft from T1, but it really is something you absolutely have to execute on very quickly. And Gen.G honestly just answered incredibly well. Really like a couple of the picks here. The Taliyah pick in general I think is really strong, and I really like B5 Camille. I've actually been pretty anti-Camille in general over the course of the playoffs. I think that there are a lot of better top laners that do what Camille does, but a little bit stronger right now. But I think specifically into Aatrox, if that champion is going to rise in popularity, Camille is something that handles Aatrox incredibly well and makes it very difficult for him to play the game. And we saw that in here. Top lane was very Gen.G favored, but it certainly wasn't the only lane. My player of the game in game number 1 is going to go to Chovy in the mid lane on Taliyah. Really good game number 1. It's kind of funny, we see Chovy and Faker go head to head here. They both kind of have their own connotations, and they're kind of on opposite spectrums, where Chovy is often considered kind of the more selfish player, somebody who wants to play for laning phase, who is going to try to generate these massive CS leads and carry the game in the back half, and Faker is going to be a lot more willing to leave lane and play for his teammates and be proactive, etc., etc. But it was kind of the opposite in this game. Faker was up 30 or 40 CS in this game, but that's not because he was outplaying Chovy, but because Chovy was playing Taliyah and moving everywhere on the map and doing so much for the team, and it ended up being such a positive for Gen.G overall. Really can't say enough good things about Chovy's performance in this game. In my opinion, he was very clearly the most important player towards what Gen.G was doing, but you gotta give a big shout out to this bot lane as well. Paze really stepped up. He's honestly been probably the weakest member of this team in the playoffs in particular, which is certainly not what I expected. He was really good in the playoffs. In spring, he was really good at MSI as well. And so to see him struggle as much as he has, it's certainly concerning, but he did not struggle in this game. He got a favorable matchup. We'll talk about Lucian in a second. Really don't like that pick in the meta right now, but Paze certainly took advantage of it, getting 12 kills on Zeri. Certainly not an easy thing to do, and then Delight obviously being somebody who facilitated that. Peanut had a really good game on the Sejuani, but he's basically only had good games in the playoffs. That Hanwha Life series was a stomp. That series against T1, he was a lot better than Owner, and, now he's doing it again. And so Peanut continuing to look good. Like I said, Doran on the Camille looking really good in this particular matchup. Really like the flexibility of Gen.G, and they just continue to show that if you give them the opportunity to play for more macro situations with something like Taliyah and Chovy moving around the map, they're going to just be better at it than what you're going to be at being able to stop it. So impressive stuff from them. But for T1 on the other side, I just don't like this idea for game number 1. It's pretty risky. I like obviously Aatrox in the top lane. Zeus has been really good on it. Maokai I think is relatively safe. Your R1, R2 is fine, and even the Jace on R3 I think is fine. But closing out this draft with Lucian Nami I think just narrows your win probability so much, and your possibilities for how you want to play this game so much, because you really, really need to dominate the early 2v2, and that means Owner is going to have to put a ridiculous amount of pressure into this bot lane, but then you're going to allow the Taliyah to move around because she's going to have some prio in the lane against Jace, and so there's really no easy answer to this, and I think unfortunately the Lucian was just the biggest problem in this game for T1. Gumayushi is going to get my dud of the game because he was doing literally no damage. Now, you could argue it isn't entirely his fault, but he's been opting into bad AD carry picks the entirety of this playoffs. Basically, with the exception of the KT series that we just had, the semifinals, every single game, Gumayushi is trying to pick something wild in the bot lane instead of just going to the things that we know are good. Kai'Sa falls through pick ban again this game, and it's just very surprising to see him continue to prioritize champions that I think a lot of people would consider weak and honestly not look very good on them instead of going to the champions that a lot of people know are strong. And so it's certainly concerning. Keria playing the Nami, obviously, because of the Lucian. I don't know why these two think that this is the lane to go to. Keria obviously showing that he still favors enchanters. I think that's fine, but I don't think you need to play the Lucian with an enchanter. Kai'Sa plus Lulu is very dangerous. Hell, play Kog'Maw. I don't even care at this point. Just play something a little bit more carry-oriented, I would say, down in that bot lane. But Faker also struggled. Again, was up in CS, but had basically no impact on any of these fights. Zeus got dominated in the top lane matchup. Just in general, this was a very Gen.G favored game, and that's super impressive for this team that I think a lot of people, you know, really wanted to see good things out of. This was a great start to the series. T1's definitely going to have to bounce back, though. We saw them go up 2-0 in the semifinals. Are they going to go down 0-2 in the finals, or are they going to be able to even up this series at one apiece and make this interesting? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Gen.G. They are going to be able to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and it's looking pretty darn good for Gen.G at the beginning of the series, but it was the same thing we were saying about T1 in the previous one. They're now down 0-2. They were up 2-0 in that series. They ended up losing games 3 and 4, and so certainly don't want to count them out just yet, but you know, Gen.G is looking really, really good to start this series. Honestly, they're just kind of clobbering T1. Neither of these first 2 games has been particularly close, basically on any front, whether that be mechanical, whether that be macro. It's all been in favor of Gen.G, and this is why I considered them the best team in the LCK, because when they're playing this well, there really isn't a lot of teams that are going to be able to consistently play against them. I think matchup-wise, T1 has always been a pretty poor matchup for T1, and I think it's always been a pretty positive matchup for Gen.G. They just match up very well into T1 in the way that they structure the game. Peanut and Chovy in particular, I think, do a really good job of being able to take down a lot of the weaknesses that Owner has in particular, and I think that was, again, very apparent in this game. It certainly wasn't just Owner's fault, but we will get to T1 in a minute. We're going to talk about Gen.G first and foremost. Player of the game for me was actually kind of tough. Quite a few players playing really well here. I'm going to give it to Peanut in the jungle on the Sejuani. Thought he was the most, like, immediately impactful and certainly the most noticeable. It really does feel like Peanut is finally starting to get his flowers from the community, which is crazy to say, but Peanut's been the best jungler in the LCK for like 2+ years now. Like, even go back to Nongshim, like, he was really freaking good on Nongshim, and like, you could have made the argument he was the most valuable jungler to his team that year, but I digress. Like, especially his time on Gen.G has really, like, solidified him as the best jungler in the LCK, and certainly one of the best junglers in the world, if not the best jungler in the world, right up there with Kanavi, I think, for a lot of people, me included. I think he has to be considered that, and I think people are finally starting to catch on to, yeah, that's, like, the floor for Peanut. That's, like, what he's going to offer you. I know there are still some questions about big games, but, I mean, come on, dude. He's dominated the LCK finals for years now, and he continued to do it again here. He was everywhere on the map, creating a lot of plays. Him and Delight in particular linked up a ton to create a ton of action, but what Peanut did was mostly in the early game. Delight kind of took over towards the mid to the late game to really create a lot of chaos on that Blitzcrank. I really want to give Peanut a lot of credit for setting the tempo early and making it a lot more difficult for T1 to play, but Delight was really close to getting this Player of the Game award. He's been really good in their playoff run as well. Super impactful. I think he's been the better member of the bot lane throughout their playoff run, and I'm just really excited to say that. I was kind of a Delight non-believer, if you will, non-bro-lever, if you will, over the course of this year. Not that I hated him or anything, I just thought that he would probably look worse on a different team, but I think he's gotten so much confidence from the rest of this team that now he's like going out and making a lot of plays that he wasn't making at the beginning of the year, and I think he looks a lot better doing that. Pays was obviously fantastic. He's like 24-0 through the first 2 games of this series. It wasn't exactly the most dominant, 12-kill performance, but he still did a good job of capitalizing on a lot of the things that I think the rest of the team created. Chovy was still good on the Sylas. Doran was definitely better in the top lane against Zeus. We'll talk about that in a second. Gen.G's just clicking. They're winning every lane. They're winning around the map macro-wise. They're getting every objective. There really just isn't a lot of weaknesses that I can point to for Gen.G right now. And then for T1 on the other side, there are so many weaknesses that I can point to that it's actually astounding. Their top side continues to be a major issue for this team in the finals, and I don't know, man. It's got to be a mental thing. It's got to be confidence, or either they're they're cursed or it's just a confidence thing at this point, because I really do feel bad for Zeus. He's going to get my dud of the game here in game number 2. I know that there's this giant narrative around him, you know, sucking in the finals. It's just really hard to believe that players are just inherently like that. You know what I mean? Like, it's hard to believe that there is a type of game that a player just simply is worse at. And that, unfortunately, seems to be the case for Zeus, who continues to struggle in big moments in big finals like this. Really was bad in this game, continuously taking 1v1 trades in the top lane when he has no idea where the enemy jungler is, getting ganked and dying because of it, you know, just consistently putting himself in bad positions that he doesn't need to be in. He was playing Cassante. He was going to be relevant towards the back half of this game if he didn't give so much gold over to the enemy team. But Owner also continued to struggle, got completely out-jungled in the early game here. Sedge should have a lot of the pressure, in my opinion, in that matchup. I know that there are some conflicting reports about that, but I definitely think Sedge is stronger early in that matchup, and Peanut did a good job of capitalizing on that, but Peanut's just better than Owner, and I think that's been very clear throughout this series. Faker has no impact even on a roaming champion like Ahri because his topside was super weak. Guma and Keria are not working. Keria continuing to go to the Lulu I think is fine, but, you know, you got to be able to win somewhere on the map in the early game. If you're playing Aphelios, you have to be able to survive elsewhere, and that just wasn't the case here, so frustrating stuff from T1, but they're not out of it yet. We've already seen an almost reverse sweep in the semifinals. Are we going to see another here in the finals, or is T1 going to go down with a whimper and not a bang? Can Gen.G close it out with a final sweep? Well, we're going to find out right now, because the winner of game number 3 was Gen.G. They are going to take that third game. They're going to keep the LCK final streak going by winning their 3rd in a row, which is wild to say considering some of the players and their reputations on this team. And they're going to do it in another sweep. It just feels like this team is destined to beat T1 in the finals in a dominant performance, and they do it again here in summer to secure their spot as the #1 seed from the LCK at Worlds in South Korea this year. Incredibly impressive stuff from Gen.G, and I hate to say it, but this is a pretty decent I told you so moment. Gen.G is not the biggest underdog or anything like that, but I received a surprising amount of disagreement when I said that they were the best team in the LCK and that they were going to get to this finals relatively unscathed, and here we are. There's really not much else to say. They dropped 2 games to T1 in the semifinals, but not a single one in either of their other 2 series. Just really good stuff coming in from Gen.G, and the legacies of a lot of these players have been firmly established at this point. There really is a lot of positives to talk about, of course. Chovy winning his 3rd in a row, Peanut winning his 3rd in a row, Doran winning his 3rd in a row, Delight coming in and winning 2 in a row, Pays as a rookie coming in and winning the first 2 in his LCK career. It's pretty wild to see how this Gen.G team has really come to fruition, but it's really impressive stuff. Let's go ahead and talk about game number 3, though, before we get into kind of the grand scheme of things, because there's quite a lot to talk about on that front as well. Player of the game for me is going to go to Pays, and he's also going to get player of the series. I know I talked about how he wasn't exactly the most, like, important player in the first 2 games, but dude, when you've got like an 11.3 KDA in the finals, you're gonna get finals MVP, and I think this game 3 was certainly important enough for him to be able to get that award. He just was fantastic in this series. He ended up going, what, like 34-3 this series? Something absurd, like something actually ridiculous. Pays was fantastic. For a 17-year-old, for a rookie, for somebody who is, you know, filling the shoes of arguably the greatest AD carry of all time on this roster in Ruler, for him to be able to come in and be as good as he's been over the course of this year, it's just absurd, and it could have never been anticipated. As good as people thought Pays was, I think that his performance and his ability to over-exceed those expectations has blown even me, and even probably his biggest supporters away with how good he has been. There's been a lot of talk about the fact that, oh, Pays is spoon-fed a really good situation here in Gen.G, and I'm certainly not going to disagree with the fact that he's got a ton of good talent around him. Chovy, Peanut, Dora, and Delight are all really good players and have all really stepped up, but Pays doesn't have the year that he has, and he doesn't have the games that he's had. You know, if he's not Pays, right, if he's not the best AD carry right now in the LCK, I truly do not believe that he plays the way that he does just based off of the team's success. I think that would be a pretty absurd thing to claim at this point, even though I see a ton of people claiming it. And so, yes, I'm a Pays believer. I put him as MVP for a reason, and he continues, in my opinion, to show that he earned that title. And, you know, as a 17-year-old in his first 2 splits winning 2 titles, that's a pretty damn good way to start off your LCK career and your pro career at the top level. Now, obviously, Worlds is going to be a little bit of a different environment and a different story, but who's to say he can't get that done as well? But Talking about the rest of the team, Delight was awesome in this series, was really good, especially in games 2 and 3. The Blitzcrank was a lot of fun. The Rakan was really good in game 3, and for Delight to get his second trophy after, we kind of wrote him off on Bro as somebody who was just kind of an okay support, at least in my opinion. That's kind of how I always viewed him on Bro. It's really good to see him do that. Chovy and Peanut again solidify their legacy. There is no doubting them anymore. Chovy went from the guy who could never win a title, the really talented player who maybe wasn't able to kind of translate that into team success, to three-peating over Faker in a LCK finals. And so Chovy solidified. Peanut is arguably one of the greatest junglers of all time at this point. Certainly like top 3. I don't even think it's really all that crazy to be able to make that statement. Doran continues to look fantastic. Another player whose legacy is really going to get underrated as we go further along. This is just a legendary Gen.G team, and one that I think we're going to be talking about. A lot of these players are borderline greatest of all time in their positions, right? Like Chovy, Peanut, they're going to be talked about for a long time, and I think this Gen.G win is certainly going to be a big one in that legacy debate because of just the amount of adversity that I think a lot of people expected them to face in the playoffs, and them not really facing it at all. And then for T1 on the other side, they tried, they did their absolute best, but this was already overperforming considering what they were in the regular season. I think a lot of people were frustrated that they got 3-0'd, that it wasn't exactly the cleanest series from them of all time, and I definitely think a lot of their weaknesses did end up getting exposed. Owner in particular is going to get my dud of the game for game 3, and he had a really bad series overall. Peanut absolutely ran him off the map in all 3 games, but that's kind of been a trend when these two teams face off against each other. Peanut does a really good job of being able to beat up on Owner. It's just always been a positive for Gen.G, and Zeus, I think, had his best game of the series, but really only so much he can do on the Gnar. Faker, tried to be active, wanted to be more active, especially after game 1, where it really felt like he wasn't the proactive mid laner, but I think it was at the detriment of the fact that he just wasn't able to do enough damage on something like the Taliyah or like the Ahri in game number 2, and then Guma and Keria were honestly not great in this series. Keria, I think, really struggled in this 3rd game on the Nautilus, his first game on an engager in quite a while. Gumayushi picking the Draven, really wanting to try and snowball the game out of control, but Pays on the Neela, being more effective, doing more damage. It's just incredibly impressive. I think when you look at T1 and when you look at what they accomplished over the course of this split, obviously it's not what they anticipated in basically any form or facet. I think getting to the finals was certainly on their bingo card. Even losing in the finals to Gen.G I don't think would have been a disastrous outcome, but considering everything that happened to this team in the regular season and considering the fact that they have auto-qualified for the World Championships, they're going to be going to Korea, I guess staying in Korea, you could say, as the number 2 seed from the LCK. The first time that Faker will be playing a Worlds in South Korea. I think that's going to be considered an accomplishment on its own, considering the fact that they were barely 500 for a lot of this split. And so for T1, you're going to be disappointed with how things ended up ending, but I think you're going to be okay with the outcome and with how we got there in the first place. But for Gen.G, fantastic performance. Just congratulations to this team. They are your 2023 Summer Split champions, and they've more than earned that accolade. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCK Summer Split Semifinals and Finals overview and analysis video, and of course, that's going to conclude my coverage on the LCK playoffs. Now, obviously, we're not done by any stretch. We've still got the regional qualifiers here in the LCK to determine the final 2 seeds. It's going to be a very, very interesting conversation to have. You've got KT Rolster taking on Hanwha Life Esports. You've got D plus Kia taking on DRX, obviously, trying to figure out who those final seeds will be. Obviously, a lot of people are going to be predicting KT and Hanwha Life to be those final 2 seeds. I'm certainly not going to be ruling that out at the moment. That's probably what I'm leaning towards. KT winning that first series, getting that number 3 seed. That should be a relatively easy task for them. It really does feel like a top 3 in the LCK, and KT is absolutely a part of that. They should be able to grab that number 3 seed, but honestly, that number 4 seed is pretty up for debate for me. I would be stunned if DRX ended up even winning a series to get there, but, D plus Kia has certainly done worse, but I think in general, DK is a team that people should not be entirely underestimating. We know what Canyon and Showmaker can do in the regional qualifiers. Look at what they did last year after underperforming so much in the summer split, so I'm certainly not going to count them out. Hanwha Life certainly looking better in the regular season, especially when they faced off in the back half in the last week of the regular season, but I certainly do think it's going to be a lot closer than people anticipate. I think either Hanwha or DK will end up taking that number 4 seed, depending on if Canyon and Showmaker show up, but would love to know you guys' thoughts and opinions. Of course, let me know what you thought of Gen.G taking the title as well, and T1 not being able to get the job done, KT losing in the semifinals. Would love to know your thoughts on both of the series we covered today. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Worlds is right around the corner, and we've covered all 4 of the major regions all year long leading up to this point. And so if you want some in-depth analysis on a lot of these Worlds teams and what they're going to be able to potentially do at the tournament, this is the place for that coverage. Go ahead and hit subscribe. Hit that bell so you can be notified when a lot of that coverage ends up going live later in the month. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.